Hey, good to see you. Thanks for coming. This is another episode of Wireframe brought to you by Design Systems House. I'm your host, Dato. Today, we're going to be talking about worldwide components. And to do that today, I have one of the probably better people to talk about web components. The vice president of web components is here on the show. It's Michael Ward. Michael, thank you for being on the show with me today. I really appreciate it. Here as a politician of web components. I mean, I'm curious about how you get elected in this whole thing. Well, first off, who the heck are you? Let's start with that, and then you can tell me about how you became a vice president out here.
For sure. So I guess the short version is I'm not really anybody, and that's a self-proclaimed title, so we can sort of just cut that off there. There are no elected officials in the web components world.
Not yet.
Maybe it's the Chrome devs, like the people who write Chrome and Mozilla. Maybe those are the real cabinets of web components, but the web components is a self-proclaimed title. But no, I'm happy to be here. I'm stoked to be a guest on your show. It's fantastic. I have been doing design system dev for quite a long time. I think I started in, I will say 2013 or so, sort of building shared component libraries. I've worked for Capital One and CarMax, so mostly big companies, and that's sort of where a lot of my experience comes from. Started doing shared component libraries, in the Angular 1 days, and then sort of transitioned that into building a couple of design systems, mostly out of web components these days. I feel like that's sort of a good way to do it a lot of the time, especially for large companies. And so that's sort of what I've been doing a lot of, is building design systems as best I can and trying to learn about them and talk about them and, shit post about them on Blue Sky, things like that.
That's the best kind. The best kind of posting is absolutely ship posting for sure. Yeah, so I wanted to bring Michael on to talk about web components. I have a history of web components myself, but I've been out of the game for a while. There's a lot of new technologies when it comes to web components out there that I think, I wanted to kind of raise for folks that are listening out there that are interested. And just before getting on the show today, we were kind of talking about a little bit about the kind of the news items that have occurred in web components land, where it's like every once in a while something comes up and someone wants to be very negative about web components, and then Michael has to come in and basically kind of poo-poo upon that a little bit. So tell me a little bit about like how you got started in web components. Like what was the onset for you for that kind of building and learning?
I think the onset for me was sort of just shared components in general, and I landed on the design system team that was already built of web components.
Oh wow!
The reason why it was sort of supporting a fairly large sort of micro front end application that had lots of different sort of micro front end remotes, sort of sub application component things that ostensibly could be in any framework. So there was a lot of Vue, a little bit of React, right? And we worked at I worked at an Angular shop, right? And so there was always the chance of Angular sort of components being micro front end application type things. They were mostly pages, but the architecture of the application meant that they weren't really necessarily having to be pages, right? And so the existing design system that was there when I got there was built of web components on purpose because it was supposed to provide the consistency for all of these different micro front ends to look like they belong to the same application, because when they render, they do end up being in the same application. And so my first exposure to that was Stencil.js. It was all written in Stencil. And basically, how I got started building on web components is sort of refactoring that library away from Stencil and into Lit. We weren't happy with some of the things that Stencil did, and Lit was a lot cleaner, a lot smaller, and a lot better. I think back in those days, it might have changed. I haven't used Stencil in quite a long time, but things like all of your component methods had to be async because Stencil sort of forced you to have them be async because they use this sort of loader mechanism that was also async. And so that sort of filtered down to all the classes that define web components. And we can get into like how you write a web component a little bit if we want to, but classes are great. Actually, that's one of my first hot take is classes are great. I don't care what the hooks people from React say, that classes are awesome. But it doesn't make sense for an async method to be async if it's not actually doing any fetching or any sort of async things that you need. So a lot of the methods that we had were, open and show a dialogue or something, and they didn't really have to be any async at all. But Stencil forcing them to be was kind of weird. So I refactored that library away from Stencil into Lits, and that effort and sort of how all of that works sort of, I guess, red pilled me or blue pilled me into like the design systems are really great when they're built of web components, because a web component can run anywhere there's a browser.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the superpower of them. Not to say that there's not, bad things about them. Of course there are. There's always trade-offs with anything. But the fact that you can ship a web component and it'll sort of work anywhere in any framework or no framework or on WordPress or, whatever your sort of deployment stack is, was fantastic. And so I sort of fell in love with them from that point on, and sort of developed an identity and a series of sort of opinions about that web components are great ways to build design systems, especially for large companies who have to pass these components around to lots of places, or that don't want to interject the tech stack of the design system onto the teams, right? I think that's another important thing to me, sort of philosophically, is that the design system team should not play a part in deciding the tech stack of the product. That they can be and should be separate, because that should be the product team's job to figure out what the best fit tool is to use. And that, sort of philosophically, design systems ought to support anyone doing anything as much as possible. And then for me, the decision to sort of use web components a lot is sort of, it falls out of the bottom of that principle of trying to help as many people as possible, because web components tend to be the cheapest, fastest, and easiest way to do that.
100%. Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree with what you're saying there for sure. And I love the talking about the journey and how you got there. Absolutely. I'm going to share a little bit about my journey, because I feel like I was similar to you in terms of the way that I was thinking about this thing, because when I was working at Compass, I was building out a design system team, and Compass started when I shouldn't say it started. When I got there, it was a Angular shop, and then it slowly started turning into React at the time. So this is between 2017, 2019. So it slowly turned to React, and from a design system standpoint, if you're going to have a reusable library, I knew that I didn't want to maintain several different frameworks of the same thing, right? Because they all render HTML at the end of the day, but HTML isn't really like transposable, right? It's really hard to like move that around in these frameworks. So like to have something that was browser based, right? Just like it's native to the browser, that was going to be able to package what the logic and the styles and all that stuff for a component would be, such that you could just go ahead and ship it and place it on your page and it'll be done, sounded really great to me. I was like, oh, okay, this is what we should be doing. Unfortunately, I hit a big brick wall back in 2019. Can you guess what the brick wall was?
That browsers didn't actually support them?
No. So the browsers overall absolutely definitely supported them back then. And it was early on, so it was very much like the class-based stuff. But the brick wall was React. React was the brick wall. And the reason why React was the brick wall is because React is very opinionated about its state. It wants to be in charge of its state and the application and the whole thing. And the problem is that you had to try to kind of determine who was going to be in charge of state at that point, because you often, I think, and you can correct me here, but often you are also holding state in the web component, right? Within the class, you're trying to, say if the menu's open, the menu's closed. So within the web component, if you're holding state in there, meanwhile, you have state for the React, it doesn't know which one is supposed to be the source of truth. So what I was trying to do at the time was, or at least my design that I did was on the class, I had a very special method, or I guess like or key on the web component in the JavaScript that was called .state. And if anything was wired to .state, that means that the state was managed externally versus the state being managed internally if it was never wired to it. So that was on its way to allowing React to behave a little bit in the ecosystem, and I got it to work to a degree. The problem was it started to be event handlers. Like event handlers was being a serious problem, but ultimately I tried hiring someone who was an expert in React back then. That person didn't turn out to be the expert that I thought they were, because I gave them free reign. I was like, just, hack it as much as you can about, find all the little idiosyncrasies of like the framework to try to make it work. And they couldn't do it. And I was unfortunately very disappointed. But I will say that I got my current job because of web components, because the team that was assessing me thought that I was doing basically magical shit they've never seen before by writing all of the classes, raw dogging them, and making web components that way. So I'm proud of that part, but unfortunately I haven't written a lot of web components, and there was a lot of things since then, and there's a lot of things that I've been looking at and know about, like in terms of improvements, but I haven't actually done. So like, what's some of the new stuff in web component land that we could probably jump into?
So I think a lot of things have changed, especially since 2019. So for me, the big year I think in web components, and I'm really happy to say that I think web components are still in their sort of moment right now, where there's lots of exposure, there's lots of awareness, there's lots of new things coming out that are sort of showcasing the power of web components. And we web components folks love to talk about those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But 2020 sort of was the year where all of the specs were sort of finally supported that would give that really strong foundation. Now, nothing is perfect. These specs are not complete. There's lots of other work to do and lots of new things to think about, because the way that we all want to work with the web is always constantly changing. And so there's lots of different features that we would want to have now that weren't part of the original spec. But the original sort of, I guess, version 2 of the spec, I'll say, finally got implemented across all of the browsers without any polyfills as of 2020. So that was really the sort of the jumping off point for being able to do all of these things and not have to use, workarounds like Polymer that was using. And so you really could sort of jump to something a lot more lightweight and then sort of actually writing the web components yourself. So like the 2020 really was that year where it really could sort of finally take off. And then, since then, stuff like Lit sort of rising in popularity helps sort of round over some of those edges, right? And this is something that we talk about all the time, where because web components are sort of a browser standard, they are purposely low level.
Mm-hmm.
The hooks that you get if you're going to raw dog a web component are purposely like close to the bare metal, right? Like you don't get things like hooks and state management and things by default. You have to wire that up yourself. A lot of people will sort of that come from framework land or are used to framework land, or sort of they want all of that stuff to sort of be baked in. Like if you come from React, then state management is sort of part of the React ecosystem, right? Reactivity in general is part of how components sort of work. But if you're going to raw dog a web component, you have to wire your own state. Right. Re-rendering a template is another one of those things, right? Like it's not just what happens when properties changes. Usually the thing that happens when properties change is re-rendering a template, right? That's kind of what we want to do. And a lot of those concepts are a little bit new, right? In terms of the web, and in terms of when I guess the idea of component itself is sort of new and it has changed shape over the years of what a component even means. But then the idea of reactivity, where changing a prop on a component renders a different template, and all of the different ways to do that, right? Like that's why we have all of these frameworks that we have. React uses the virtual DOM to check and see what's different and only renders the ones that have changed. And Solid uses signals and does sort of fine-grained attacking those, right? And Lit uses dirty checking and some of those things, right? There's a whole bunch of different ways to do that, but ultimately that process of reactivity of re-render some template is something that didn't really exist as a concept when web components were invented. And I think that's one of those specs that I would love to see added in the future, is that reactivity thing, piggybacking on some of the other new things like landing to the JavaScript language, like signals, like decorators, and some of those things will help sort of figuring out where the template goes and how it gets changed and things. But by the same token, like if you're asking sort of like what's new in web components, it's not really the features in web components since 2020. There's been little small things, right? A big one coming up is reference target. That's been huge, which will allow you to pass an ID reference outside of the web component to something inside the web component. So think like any like ID and label and for equals and labels for form elements. If you have a label that's outside of a shadow root and a form element inside, then you can accessibly attach those two things through the shadow root boundary with some new attributes.
Right, because famously the boundary was the thing that was keeping everything safe, so to speak.
Yes.
Right, and you would actually, like, one of the features that I would use all the time is the IDs would be local inside of the shadow root, so that I could just use IDs for everything internally. But now you're saying you're able to actually cross the boundary. Is this specifically for accessibility, or are there other reasons for this?
Mostly for accessibility because it's an ID reference process. So they use IDs. Like, so anything that you know, any sort of web attribute that you put an ID into, then the ID can refer to something inside of a shadow root boundary where previously it couldn't. Right. And like you said, the encapsulation of web components, whether or not that's a good thing, really does depend on who you're talking to and what they're trying to do. And that's one of those things where my little spiel about that is that I think that when web components were conceived, the idea of a component was that it was a third-party thing off the internet that you got that was written by somebody else that, you know, you couldn't necessarily trust, you know, to interact with your application the way you wanted it to. And so you had to wall it off, and that it was good that you walled it off. In that situation, I still think that web components are super powerful in their encapsulation, right? But I think one of the problems that people have with that encapsulation and the difficulty they find is that 99% of the components we write on a daily basis as devs are components that we wrote for our own app. We don't pull as many third-party things anymore. And so the definition of component has flipped since the web component spec was invented, where previously it was 90% meant to be an external thing and 10% meant to be a thing you wrote yourself. Now it's flopped the other way, where the word component 99% of the time means something I wrote for my own app that I should be able to control and do all the stuff. And then that's where the encapsulation kind of breaks down, because I don't want that encapsulation a lot, because I want it to participate in the rest of my app because it knows about it because I wrote it. You know, kinds of things.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense. I mean, it
depends on who you talk to, whether or not the encapsulation is a good thing or a bad thing, and what they're trying to do in terms of how they're trying to compose components. You know, like if you never tried to compose a label outside of a shadow root with just the form element, then you would never run into the reference target problem. You know, I've never done that. I have always put the label and the form element inside the same shadow root, and it works perfectly fine. You know, but there are pros and cons with that approach. You know, like progressive enhancement is one of those, and, you know, things like that.
Yeah, similar for me as well. As I've always tried to connect them because I knew about the reference problem. I won't say problem, feature. I don't know. It's there. It's a feature, right? So actually, you know, the thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is all this declarative stuff that's coming around, right? So we have like the Declarative Shadow DOM as one of the features that came out. What was it, last year, the year before, or something like that, as baseline. And for those of you who don't know, I mean, if you're familiar with the Shadow DOM, you're either love it or hate it, right? But ultimately, you know, for a long time, you've had to do it through JavaScript. You'd have to declare it inside of the class that was basically defining the web component, and that made it very JavaScript dependent, right? And this Declarative Shadow DOM allowed you to effectively write a template tag and then declare what the shadow root was going to be in that special shadow root open template tag. Now, I'm talking about this in particular because I felt like it missed the plot, because what I was trying to do years ago was I was trying to mimic what the use tag in SVG does, right? Now, yeah, so Mike's shaking his head right now. He's picking up what I'm putting down. Effectively, if you're not familiar with the use tag in SVG, it's very, very popular when it comes to rendering icons, right? So what you'll end up having in your HTML is you'll have this sprite sheet, so to speak, and in that sprite sheet you'll have all the symbols of SVGs that you would expect to have on the page. And you could kind of think of the icon library that is as almost like a mini component library, where you can reference or re-reference those icons without actually putting all of the markup that is required for that icon, and copy it over and over again. You can have a reference using the use tag in HTML, or really, I guess it's XML, into the HTML page, and it would actually render and re-render those icons in place without having all that markup. And I was like, I want this for web components. And for some people out there, you're like, well, isn't the web component already doing that? And the answer is, well, yes, if you're doing it from a JavaScript point of view. But once you start going into declarative, that's when you need to, again, re-render these shadow DOMs over and over and over again, right? So now this is where I was like, well, when are we going to solve this? And that's why this morning, before this show, I saw this new specification for basically updating the template tag again to now do referencing inside of the page. So it was Mike did some research about the what is it, the streaming today, and I think I buried I think I kind of went off task a little bit, because the thing that I was really interested about in there was the referencing part, right? So if I'm reading the specification correctly, it looks like we might be able to have a declarative shadow DOM on the page that's rendered once and then potentially reference it amongst places in the page. That's what I'm hoping. I might be wrong, but is that something that you've ever wanted, or what's your take on all that?
Sure. So like the first thing I'll say is, like, congratulations, you've discovered why standards is hard, right? And doing standards is hard because everybody sees a feature and immediately has a mental model that's built around maybe something that the standards people creating the standards did not see,
right,
or was termed by a different name, right? So the way that SVG use works, I would sort of akin that to more like HTML includes kind of thing of sort of including a template somewhere on the page, maybe potentially multiple times from somewhere else, right? Or and to that end, templates kind of already do that. Like you said, it's imperative that they can do that, because you can take the contents of a template and throw it anywhere else you want to, and the template itself is not rendered on the page, just like uses definitions and SVGs aren't rendered on the page either. So imperatively speaking, like, templates kind of already do that. Now, whether or not this new feature is going to allow us to sort of have that SVG use approach, I'm not sure. I think it's more related to when the browser receives data that the browser will fill it in. I don't know if we have declarative control over doing that feature ourselves, or whether that depends on the streaming. And that's kind of why I went to the streaming approach. Is I think that it's about when you're fetching data and calling some imperative functions, because you're sort of fetching the data in JavaScript still, that you're able to assign DOM using those markers and things.
I think it's probably closer to like
data fetching.
I think it's probably closer to like HTMX. Like, it's probably something more similar where you're, again, like you're bringing in like a little snippet of HTML into a spot, right? And this is where you want it to go, as opposed to rendering the entire page without a native like fetch. Like, because in all of those examples, they're really like calling upon, this is how we used to do it with fetch, and now this is what we're like proposing. And like, I totally get that, but I think the thing that I was again looking at was like, oh, we could potentially reuse existing HTML maybe in there, based on like what I was looking with the markers. But I could be wrong.
Potentially, yeah. I think that's my sort of take on it. And again, how that sort of relates back to the declarative shadow DOM thing is, that's another one of those like situational things that have changed in the way that we build applications a little bit since the before times when just the web component specs were being formulated and worked on. Is that there's a little bit of a shift back to the server nowadays, where as soon as I mentioned these three scary letters, SSR, right, server-side rendering, that now there's 55 different ways to do it. You can do SSR, you can do SSG, you can do ISR, you can client-side render it, like React does by default, all of those things. The declarative shadow DOM is sort of an answer to that, of sort of trying to go back to the server, and that one is also weird to me too.
Okay.
In that, and this is one of the gripes that like people have against web components. Like one of the major gripes that people have against web components is, how do I render them on the server? And I sort of find that to be a little bit of a non-starter question, because my answer always is another question that says, what do browser developers care about what happens on the server? There's no browsers on the server. There's Express and Fastify and HTTP handlers and things. There's not Chrome and and all of those things happening, and that's what they're in charge of. And web components are a browser web spec. They're not a server web spec. And I don't know who to ask about what should happen by default on a server, because I don't think there is a standards body for Express.
Okay.
I don't think there is a standards body for what should happen on the server, right? And so Declarative Shadow DOM was a format that you could put web components into that once the browser parses will turn it into that custom element for you sort of automatically. And that's kind of how it was designed.
Okay.
The part that people are missing and really want, I think, in the community of us devs is, how do I get my source code, which has a web component written in it, into the DSD, and then the browser turns it back into the web component? And what do those steps look like? And how do I save bytes with shared styles? Or how does all that work? And that's sort of the part that we don't really have great answers for right now, especially with native web components. Like Lit has an SSR plugin, that works in a variety of different other frameworks who also have server JSs and things. But there isn't a solution for just take any old native web component using any old server framework and then just do the thing. And I think that's a bit of a non-starter. I think it would be really hard to actually come up with such a solution because there's nobody to make it be a standard.
Okay. So I could answer a bit of the second question you have, because you're talking about no browser in the server effectively. And the reason why I got so interested specifically about all the declarative stuff is because this is heading toward not requiring JavaScript. Right. So that was basically my big answer was, okay, well, with the web component, I need JavaScript. And granted, yes, like the large majority of people have JavaScript turned on, right? And it's no big deal. Like we that's what kind of expected in the world of interactivity. But how much of this can I still do? Because I was really interested in web components, but how much can I do in a way such that I don't need to rely on the JavaScript in order for the page to behave properly? And that was basically what my vision was when thinking about this stuff declaratively, because then I'm just serving HTML like we've been doing for decades at this point, and serving HTML and getting the result that I'm expecting immediately without having to wait for any kind of cycles to kick in, I felt as a benefit, right? As soon as you introduce that JavaScript, it's like, who knows what's going to potentially happen, especially like when like fetching definitions, right? It's actually my first blog post was all about fetching web component definitions, and there's a whole bunch of like gotchas that ends up in there, of course, like basically what you mentioned about what happens when a web component's inside of another web component. You have to get that redefined, and you have to know that it's there, and like there's a whole bunch of gotchas that end up going on in there. So that's effectively what the answer was for me.
And I'm 100% there with you, right? Like and I think this is another one of those like when people who sort of support and like and use web components sort of come against people who like and use frameworks and sort of prefer that style of building, I do think there's kind of two camps sort of forming, which is a little bit political, kind of like it's not a politics thing, but it is a little bit like there's two teams forming, which is, I would describe sort of you potentially and maybe myself, and I don't want to put any labels on it, but sort of firmly into like no build script, less JavaScript camp. And then there's another group who's a little bit more like more JavaScript, but maybe it's on the server this time. Maybe it's in a build script. There's a group that's like, I should just be able to push an HTML file and still have all the same interactivity things, right? I shouldn't have to run a build. I shouldn't have to do all these other things. I shouldn't have to have Node.js or NPM or packages and all that kind of fun stuff. There's lots of validity to that. I think on the other side, and there might be more sides, but on the other side, there's a embracing of the build system and using those build tools even more so, right? Which is, React and I think Solid and Vue are heading into the compiler space, Svelte, right? Where it's not just that you have source code, it's that you have a source code and a compiler that takes that source code and turns it into other code, that is hopefully faster, smaller, that it compiles out some of the JavaScript and then put some of those things on the page within that framework's state management and hydration and all those other features that you get, right? I think we're ultimately kind of on the same team, but I think we're taking different routes to get there, because I do think that the ultimate goal of things like React server components and these compiler steps and things is to put less JavaScript on the final page that finally ends up in the browser. I think where we sort of end up picking sides is like how that all happens with more build stuff and more JavaScript and more tooling and more Rust and more, Node.js and NPM, or with less of it, with HTML files, right? Another thing I'll say is that the declarative aspect of these things is hugely, I think, interesting to the standards bodies and a bunch of developers as well. And there's some very exciting things that are potentially on the frontier here. The idea of doing completely declarative custom elements has been thrown around for a long time.
Yeah.
If you could define a component declaratively in an HTML structure and an HTML file, and then just have the browser take care of all of it, I think that is probably one of the holy grails in terms of web components these days, is being able to completely do it.
Are we getting closer with the invokers, right? Is that where that's coming in, or is that separate, different? Where does that fit in?
I think I would say tangentially dotted line related, right? Like, so invokers and the interest fors and command fors and pop over target and anchor positioning and all of those fun things that are happening in HTML and CSS, they're all going to reduce the amount of JavaScript that you have on your page.
Right.
That JavaScript is not web component JavaScript, though.
Okay.
It's just regular old JavaScript. Like that could be jQuery library replacing kind of thing, of just you're just taking this element, when you click on it, then you pop up another thing.
Okay.
You could make a web component that does that, but you don't have to. And a lot of libraries don't.
So what's the JavaScript that is web component JavaScript that we would be replacing then in this particular case?
It would be some of the imperative custom elements.define, right? Of like the registration process of the web component. So there's a couple of related ideas. And again, I'm not going to call them specs. They're not even really proposals. They've been sort of proposed, but then there's lots and lots of edge cases and squirrely, features, things to work out. But imagine a situation like this. Imagine a situation where you could write components.html, and it maybe looks a lot like a view file. If you've ever seen a view file, right? At the top, you have some template. In the middle, you define a style tag, and then you have a script tag that has some JavaScript that runs in it, right? Maybe Astro, an Astro file similar, works kind of the same way, right? But what if that file wasn't a custom extension? What if a file like that was an HTML file? And the browser received that file, and in the process of parsing and rendering, ran all the things, right? What if the script had the class in it that was defined as the web component, and the template started with your custom tag name, right? Some of those things, right? Then that would be a sort of a completely declarative way to establish that a web component exists, but also have the imperative nature of the web component, which is what happens after it's defined and upgraded. Because you still need JavaScript to run the component and change its state and render its properties and be reactive and all those fun things after the definition. So the declarative custom elements sort of work, potential spec and proposals and things, along with things like HTML modules. So maybe you can sort of import an HTML file, right? Like a bunch of those things. And what happens when you do that? Those would all potentially give us the ability to sort of write custom elements HTML first. Which would be, I think, what you're talking about, which is you could do almost anything with those, right? The way that I have seen some of the proposals line up. They probably won't be exactly the same as the proposals, and there's probably a lot more to it, but that's sort of the goal behind the effort of getting completely declarative custom elements. It would be amazing, I think. It would be a real cool addition to the web, is getting the interactivity, getting that functionality, getting all that behavior stuff, but doing it in a declarative mechanism would be great.
Yeah, no, I'm 100%. I'm definitely looking forward to that for sure. Because like I said, this has been a dream, basically, based on my foundations of the ways that I think about how I build the web. Because I'm a big Astro fanboy. I think a lot of people know that already. That I think Astro as a framework is from how long I think we have been writing in the web. I would say. Astro makes a lot of sense to me in terms of the expectations that I would have had in terms of, writing with the web with, templates and very little JavaScript, but just rendering, kind of simply. I think just all that makes a lot of sense to me. So I want to change a little bit of gears here and actually talk something about that. Um, I asked you to be on the show, and I'll ask you, an audience, also, if you want to be on the show, please go to wireframe.ds.house and fill out the form. And when Michael filled out the form, one of the things that you put on the form was build versus buy. And I think this is a big question that a lot of people have in the design system space. And I'm going to say maybe prior to AI, because now with AI, it's just basically build, build, build. But I'll say prior to the AI, and even there's probably still an argument for the build versus buy, even in the AI space, because of the vetting of the components out there. But tell tell me the argument about the build versus buy on your side.
Sure. So, quick, small sort of context, but and a tiny little plug, right? The idea of this concept has been around for a long time, but I'm trying to formalize it because I'm working on a course about how to build design systems, and hopefully releasing soon. And this idea is, I think, one of the preeminent sort of decisions that people have to make when they're going to start off with trying to build a design system, or I'll say have a design system at their organization, right? Because if you haven't made the decision of build versus buy, we can't say you're building it yet, right? But the idea is it better or useful or more valuable to your team and your organization to construct your design system basically from scratch, or to import and consume any of the number of millions of them that exist out there on the internet that you can just sort of install and use, right? The typical examples are like Material UI or ShadCN, or some people consider sort of Tailwind and Bootstrap to be design systems. I think we might be able to argue over what that term actually means, and I think it means a lot of things to different people.
That's another show for later for sure. We're going to definitely argue about that. Yeah,
we could be there for 6 more hours talking about that. But I'm a dev, and so if it doesn't have components in it, then it's not a design system to me.
Boom.
Right? I don't think that just CSS or just tokens count. That's just my personal opinion. Would love counter.
See you in the comments, folks. Make sure you fight Michael in the comments. He's ready for it.
I love it. So the question is, what do you do? Because as a person getting started on formulating a design system team, or getting the concept together and putting a deck to leadership to sort of propose the value that we should have this at the company because we don't already, and you see all of these things that exist out there. One of the reasons why I put so much importance and stress on this is that I feel like whatever direction you choose, you're going to get questions about that the entirety of the existence of the design system, about why you went the way you went, right? Especially if somebody else thinks that you should have gone the other way, right? If you decide to build it from scratch, but there are libraries that exist, then someone somewhere is going to say, why didn't you just use Material, right? If you decide to use Material, and somebody thinks that it might be too big or too bloated or has too many things, or they don't like how it works, they're going to ask you, why didn't we just build it from scratch so we don't have to be dependent on how Material UI works, right? So the act of making this choice and writing down that rationale for later is, I think, paramount, and one of the first things that you have to do if you're going to decide to put a design system together. And in the course, I wanted to sort of highlight what I think to be some pros and cons of that decision and the ramifications of that thing, because the older I get, the more senior I get, the more I answer questions with "it depends," and it's all about trade-offs, right? It's all about what's important to your company, and I always want to sort of approach that kind of conversation like, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'm just trying to give you a framework in which you can make your own choice, and that whatever choice you make as a new, spinning up a design system team, it should be whatever works for your company and your organization and your consumers. It shouldn't just be what I want you to do, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So that's sort of the framework of the decision is, should you build it from scratch? Should you sort of start from nothing? And or should you consume something off the shelf, essentially, and then start from everything? And then what are the trade-offs and pros and cons of both of those decisions so that you can weigh them in an informed kind of way?
Yeah, that's cool. The thing that I'm thinking about from what you said there is the decision to basically say, hey, it depends. Like that's a clear decision, because that I'm reminded of that specifically because of my book. And you plug the book, of course, yes, but I want to talk more about my decisions inside of the book, specifically because when I was writing that book, I was between, do I tell you how I think it should be done versus here's some things that you could do. And I actually went into the no, this should be done this way. And the reason that I ended up doing that is because I mean, first off, I have a lot of experience in this stuff. I've researched this particular topic for 4 years amongst the community and working with it in internally in several areas. So I'm like, I'm very well experienced in this, and therefore the result of this, I do truly believe of being the thing that you need to get to. But the thing that I was paying attention to as well is that here's the North Star. I don't know what problems you have, what culture you have, what organizational structure you have, in order to make all the different branches that could potentially maybe lead you up there, because I would feel like, oh well, I didn't account for your particular scenario and therefore you feel alienated because, oh, you don't know my scenario. Well, now it's almost like, I'm not biased, I hate everybody equally, right? It's basically like, I'm not biased. I'm just like equally saying that this is the North Star, and however you get there is effectively up to you. It's your responsibility. It's your decision to go in a particular direction. So I always think it's very interesting, I suppose, to have folks thinking about the opposite, about saying, here are the options that you can take, and kind of, we'll try to guide you here, but then I'm always worried about, like, oh, did I forget about something that this person could have been paying attention to, and what have you? And I think from a course perspective, especially if I don't know enough about the course yet, but from a teaching perspective, because that I could at least tell you about from education on my side, is that every individual, of course, being different, getting communicating what you're trying to teach to the individual always ends up having to be catered in a particular way for the individual, and that's always a challenge. What experience have you been having in making this course? Like, what's past the like decision to have these different paths effectively? What else have you been cooking at over there?
That's a tough one. I don't want to give too much away because I'm still early.
Well, no content, but just like what
but
what kind of decisions have you been making in that space, I think?
so in terms of like how I want to structure these kinds of things, right? It really does kind of go back to a little bit of how I believe about making design systems, right? I have seen a couple of things like Brad Frost's idea of making sort of a global design system. Right. He a couple of years ago, he was really sort of popular about that. I haven't seen much about that lately, but yeah. I think he was for a little while, he was on a kick of like, we should just have one design system. And I see the merits of that approach, right? The fact of the matter is, every time we build a new design system, it still has the same components in it as every other design system.
100%.
Like we have all built 4 or 5 different button components, and they're all the same.
Only 4 or 5?
Theoretically.
Good Lord.
Right? It could be hundreds, right? It could be a lot, right? And that part of it sucks a little bit. I think that part of it feels like you're reinventing a wheel.
Yeah.
Where I kind of have turned the corner on that is that you're not, because that button is not actually the same as all the other buttons. It might do the same things in your app because it has the same role, because buttons just have a role of how what they do inside of websites and applications. But how you make it is still going to be slightly different than how everybody else makes it. And that's kind of why I think that a global design system won't work. And it's no discredit to Brad. It's a great idea, and I wish we could do it. But it's a simple thing like design language that makes it not be able to work. And that's sort of one of the, going back to the build versus buy discussion, that's one of the drawbacks of inheriting a system, is that you have to inherit their design language. And if you are in an industry or a company that has particular ways you want to refer to things, then if you inherit a component system off the shelf or a design system off the shelf, you're not going to be able to inject your own design language into those components very easily. And so you're just going to have to mold yourself to their language instead of using yours. A great example of that is my personal preference for the word tone.
Okay.
I love the word tone to mean the role that a color plays in a system.
Okay.
Because I think it's a great way to describe why something should be blue. Not just that it's blue, but why it's blue. It's blue because it has a informational tone. And we use blue for the informational tone, right? And you can take that idea, right? Steal it, put it in your system, but you can also put it everywhere in your system. Everything that has a color can have a tone that makes it that color. Tone can be neutral, tone can be positive, tone can be whatever, right? Well, if Material UI doesn't use the word tone, but I think it would make their components better if they did. If I think it would be easier to educate my designers and developers, consumers of my system, if we were all able to figure out what tone means, and then it might make apps more consistent, because I could say to developers and designers, think about the tone that's being used for this element, right? Is this a neutral tone? Are we just sort of putting some information on the screen and who cares why we're using it? Or are we yelling at them because they're going to do something serious, right? Maybe that tone is critical or something, right? If I think that my design language would help adoption and consistency and usage and, all of those fun things, then not applying that in my system would be a detriment to that system, right? It would be a detriment to the applications built in that system. And I think it's really important to kind of make those decisions. And that's really what makes the design system your design system, even though we all have date pickers and dialogues and inputs and labels and things, right? It's not that we have them, it's how we use them and how we refer to them and how we style them and how we call them and refer to them and things, right? That makes it ours. And that's kind of what puts me always back on the side of building it from scratch, is so that you can make it yours, right? Another one is that a company's design system is necessarily going to be solving different problems different ways than a design system for the internet. Material UI, being open sourced, is designed to solve the problems of the entire internet. A company will have less of those problems and different kinds of problems. A great example of that is icon registries. When you pull in Material UI, they have no idea where you're going to get your icons from to put them in the leading and trailing spots of your buttons and to make them be the chevrons of your accordions and things. So they give you an ability to say, hook up your own icons, pull them from Font Awesome or from Hero Icons or your own set or whatever, right? But then you go to a company and a company says, no, we just have one set of icons. It's these icons, right? There's no need for a registry that you can add multiple sets of multiple icons and do all of that kind of stuff. Most of the time, it's just, here are the icons, right? We don't have 6 different versions of close X button things, right? We have one. And so all of that code that was built for the entire internet to not know what system you're going to use and be able to use any system in the thing is kind of bloat at that point. It's a bloat for a team who's never going to use it, right? And so that's kind of like the pros, and that's where those pros and cons come in, and back to the sort of build versus buy discussion, is that if you build it, then you can craft it. You can only make what you're going to use. You can make it your way. You're going to be reinventing the wheel a little bit, and that doesn't feel great. But it kind of comes with the territory of the customization that may help you in the adoption and the consistency play. That's half of the value of having one.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. So what I'm going to say is, I think that's a fairly hot take you have there. That's a fairly hot take, because I'm going to say that I'm going to be Mr. Disagree on this side.
Hey, that's my handle.
I know, it's just his handle. So basically, the thing that I'm thinking about in this thing is that, just like you said at the top of that statement about, the buttons, right? It's like, it's the same button over and over. Why do you keep remaking the button? And the answer being, well, the button here at Home Depot is fundamentally different than the button that's over here at Visa, and the button over here and the button over here. But the thing is like, I think of it from a wireframe standpoint, right? And that's a lot of the reason why the show is named Wireframe, because I put a lot of emphasis on it. And that button that would appear in the wireframe is effectively the same button that it would be in Home Depot versus Visa. Now, granted, those interfaces, those flows, that IA is very much different between an e-commerce home improvement site versus a banking and credit card site. Absolutely, right? But when you strip down all of the expression that makes something Home Depot from a visual standpoint, certainly, and less so from the functional standpoint. It's still important, but ultimately, you could have a social media site branded as Home Depot, right? Using all of Home Depot's related stuff, but it's still the same kind of layout, and you're going to need buttons, you're going to need form inputs, you're going to need, you know, cards and all of that stuff that we've seen in component after or not really component, but in library after library after library. So, you know, that's why I 100% align with Brad's initial idea of, hey, you know, a global library, which effectively was HTML. It's just us trying to extend HTML from the button situation and the links and things like that into areas that we've now identified over the years. Like we now have the dialogue component that's doing a little bit of work, right? We have those popovers that are coming up now. So all of that stuff are things that we are introducing that we've recognized as things that would be useful to standardize, right? And the standards are slow, right? That's we've talked about that already. So I think the thing that is the defining features are these expressions that really do show that this is the way that a Home Depot button is. This is the way that a Visa button is. This is the way that a Capital One button is. Like it's underlying the same foundational wireframe that is, you know, universal across the board. Still clickable, still has all those behaviors, but ultimately the way that it's presented, you as a user want to trust that I'm still in Home Depot, right? Or specifically Visa in particular, right? Where I know that I'm definitely doing some banking at this point. I wouldn't want to second guess myself because the thing that has been a button around the web is now not a button. Why is it different, right? It's just like why would it ever be different? We've landed on these, what I've called before, design attractors, these basically like settling into these patterns that are kind of ubiquitous, kind of universally known. And yeah, in the case of a material which was designed to be in the direction of being more available, sure, yeah, a smaller company doesn't need to kind of have an icon registry, right? Because they already know the one icons they're going to have. They don't need to support a whole bunch of stuff. But if you go further past the material spectrum into the global design system spectrum, and everyone was under the impression or under the understanding that you could provide any kind of expression you want to the global system. I mean, we're doing that right now. You could provide any kind of expression you want to the HTML button, right? We do that all the time. So if we had the mechanism and the understanding of being able to go ahead and provide these expressions to the global design system, I think we would end up being in a better spot in terms of not having to reinvent the wheel all the time. But I think the difficulty there, of course, is that people have these preconceived notions, these traditions about how the web works and their expectations. And that's what might be muddying the waters about what the standards should be. Because as soon as you hear standards, you go, oh, wait, you didn't consider me, you know, fuck your shit, right? I'm not using that stuff. Fuck your stuff. You didn't consider me. I'm going to do my own thing. That's what we see all the time. Right, that's the big battle when it comes to design systems. A lot of the times, right, it's just like you're killing my creativity. You wouldn't let me do my thing. The button doesn't work for me, so I'm going to make my own button. And then suddenly you're doing the button and there's 20 different things. So yeah, I think I'm admittedly on the other side in this way.
I'll do a counterpoint and say, like, I think that, like, that's a very high level discussion about like how that all works. But like what I hear talking about separating out the the functionality essentially and then the style is like headless components, headless libraries, right? Sure, yeah. Those are all the rage, they're all popular, right? I think where it kind of breaks down is that there's still bloat there, that because the way that sort of our web languages work, they are inexplicably tied together. It is very hard to make CSS that does not actually care about the HTML it's going to go to. Sure. Right? And the more complicated a feature you're going to make, like materials ripple, right? Like maybe you can do that in a single line of CSS that just goes to a class that could go on any element. But maybe you need pseudos to be there or something. Maybe there's a specific sort of architecture that you need in the HTML to do it, right? And so I don't think that headless libraries, like, I don't think they scale all the way to the sky like we would want them to, and that we ultimately bump up against that sort of that literal bare metal, the fact that HTML and CSS are connected and that we can't pull them apart like as though we might try. And so part of that like reason for sort of reinventing is that if you were to make something truly headless that would try to work for everyone, it would still have little tiny pieces of bloat for everyone, right? Let's say, like, take the humble button. I love talking about buttons because they're one of the most foundational things, but they're also deceptively complicated to make
agreed.
because there's thousands and thousands of variants with 5 properties, right? Take, for example, just like leading and trailing icons or something. If I were making a headless library, I would probably put spots for both and styles for both. A leading icon and a trailing icon, maybe both at the same time, right? All of that kind of thing. But then as a consumer, if I only want one or the other, I still have the code in there for both.
Yeah, good point.
I still have the styles in there for both, right? And so we're back to that, again, another sort of bare metal concern of bloat can be tiny. And there are people who do care about those things. I would love to care about those things, you know, about only delivering the things I need, right? And so that's kind of where the headless libraries, I feel like, can break down, because you either hit the speed bump of it can't accomplish the stylistic thing that you have to apply to it, that you want to apply to it, because your stylistic approach that you want to do depends on HTML structure that isn't there, right? And that could be a weakness of the, you know, the platform isn't there yet. You know, we haven't just made it a single line of CSS. You have to do some structuring of it first. Like, you know, grid lanes is a great example of those things where we had to do a whole bunch of JavaScript library structural stuff, and now we can just do display grid lanes and we're done, right? Like there's gonna be lots of those lags, but of those situations where you want to do something and you need some sort of connection to the structure underneath from your headless library that doesn't have it and won't put it there because it's not, you know, usable by everyone or whatever. It's just your special use case, and you're gonna constantly bump up against that thing. So I think that the reuse is sort of worth the minimizing of bloat like that, because I still think you're going to end up with it, even if you try to disconnect those features. And you may end up with more bloat because you disconnected those features. Honestly, you may have to write more CSS and more things and more structure because you disconnected them, where if you tie them together, then it actually becomes smaller. And ultimately, as a person working for a company, I have to serve my users, right? And my duty to them is, you know, to serve the smallest possible thing. And that might mean optimizing it for me. It isn't. And they don't care if there's 500 buttons out there in the world. Right. No, they should only care if the button that they get is as small as it can be, so that they can use it on a crappy 3G connection or something, and it still works right.
I'll tell you what, that the bloat part of it hits me right here for sure. Because I will say, like, it's entirely possible to go ahead and blame the people who are designing the APIs and otherwise internals for these kinds of things. It's very easy to do. But at the end of the day, you're absolutely right about, you know, I don't want to have features that I'm not using necessarily come up in my stuff, right? I want to keep that lean and keep it performant. And I think that's a really good fundamental kind of piece to have. We're coming up on time. Because I can see Mike's trying to book it a little bit more here. I want to be able to wrap up here, because we're going to have Mike on the show, I'm sure, another time here, because I love the thoughtfulness that he has in this stuff, and the hot takes are, of course, very welcome on this show. But Mike, I just want to give you an opportunity to plug anything that's going on out there in the internet that you want people to find out about, and let the people know what's going on.
So again, the thing that I'm the most stoked about right now is being able to partnership with Kevin Powell on this course that we're working on. Kevin, as far as I'm concerned, is a giant in the CSS education, YouTube content creation space. And I've been really privileged to sort of have the opportunity I've got. So if you want to head on over to his platform, the cascade.dev, look for the Thoughtful Design System course, sign up for the waiting list, or you know, any of his other courses that aren't involving me either. I'll go ahead and plug those too for him as well. And just sort of be notified of whenever any updates that we have going on, and then when the course releases, hopefully in a few months or so, to check it out. I really hope that it's going to resonate with folks, right? Especially in the sort of land of AI. Like, one of the directions I'm trying to go with it is to try to provide some things that'll still be useful even when AI is around, and, you know, try to give you some things to think about that you won't get talking to Claude as best I can. So yeah, plug in that. Also, following the socials and things. I'm trying to dip my toe a little bit into the content creator blogger type space, and it's a little bit new for me. So I've been a privilege to hang out and chat.
Hell yeah. Thank you for so much for being on the show. And yeah, definitely also read a look at the blog. I had a post today, I think you just posted this morning about the three problems in engineering are in there. So I took a peek in there. I didn't have enough time to read, but I will absolutely read. But thank you so much, Michael, for being on the show. And like I said, we're definitely going to have him on the show again. Lots of great insight and takes that I want to share and fight with you about, certainly.
I love it. I love it. Right. Invite me back for the hot takes episode. I'm there.
We'll be. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, please help out the show by smashing the like and subscribe button just to get notified the next time when we go live. And feel free to continue the conversation on the official Design Systems Discord. Go to discord.ds.house. There it is on the bottom. Play nice in those comments, and I'll see you on the internet. Bye. Thank you.